Hello everybody. If you want to read all the stories in full, please go to www.steveuk.blog. Thank you. Short story 380, The Inheritance, Upper Beginner. Sarah worked in a small bookstore in a quiet town in the English countryside. She loved books. She loved the smell of old paper, the feel of a new cover, and the stories they told. But Sarah didn't love her job. It wasn't the books, it was the pay. It was very low. She could barely afford her small flat and the bus to work. She dreamt of doing something more, something that paid better, something that would allow her to travel and maybe even buy a new coat. One rainy Tuesday morning, a postman delivered a thick, official-looking envelope. Sarah recognized the address. It was her grandmother's solicitor. Her grandmother had passed away a few months ago, and Sarah hadn't expected anything. They weren't close. Her grandmother had lived far away, and they only met a handful of times. Sarah opened the letter with trembling hands. Inside there was another envelope, and another, and another. It was like a Russian doll of letters. Finally, she reached the last one. It was a letter from her grandmother's solicitor. "Dear Miss Sarah," it read, "I'm writing to inform you of the contents of your late grandmother, Mrs. Eleanor Vance's will. Mrs. Vance has bequeathed to you her entire estate." Sarah's heart skipped a beat. Her grandmother had left her everything. But why? They barely knew each other. The letter went on to explain that her grandmother had been a very successful businesswoman. She owned several properties and had invested wisely. Sarah was now a wealthy woman. Sarah couldn't believe it. She read the letter again and again. It was real. She was no longer a struggling bookseller. She was, well, she didn't know what she was yet. The next few weeks were a whirlwind. Sarah met with the solicitor, signed papers, and tried to understand her new situation. She learned that her grandmother had left specific instructions. A large portion of the money was to be used to renovate a dilapidated old house in a small coastal town called Seabrook. Sarah travelled to Seabrook. It was a charming place with colourful houses and a beautiful beach. The old house, however, was a mess. The paint was peeling, the windows were broken, and the garden was overgrown. It looked like it hadn't been lived in for years. Sarah felt a little overwhelmed. She had never renovated a house before, but as she walked through the empty room, she started to feel a connection to the place and to her grandmother. She imagined her grandmother living there, looking out at the sea. Sarah decided to follow her grandmother's wishes. She hired local builders and started the renovation. It was a long and difficult process. There were problems with the roof, the plumbing, and everything in between. But Sarah persevered. She learned about building materials, about planning permission, and about the importance of a good cup of tea for the builders. Slowly, the house began to take shape. Sarah chose bright colours for the walls, installed new windows, and planted a beautiful garden. She wanted to create a warm and welcoming home. One sunny afternoon, Sarah was sitting in the garden, admiring her handiwork, when she noticed an elderly woman walking by. She stopped and smiled at Sarah. "This house looks wonderful," the woman said. "It's so nice to see it being brought back to life." Sarah smiled back. "Thank you," she said. "It was my grandmother's house." "Your grandmother?" the woman asked, her eyes widening. "Eleanor Vance?" Sarah nodded. "I knew Eleanor," the woman said. "We were friends. She was a remarkable woman. She told me she was leaving her house to her granddaughter. She said she hoped you would love it as much as she did." Sarah's heart swelled with emotion. She finally understood. Her grandmother hadn't just left her money, she had left her a legacy. She had left her a connection to her past and a future full of possibilities. Sarah continued to live in the house in Seabrook. She opened a small bookshop, even smaller than the one she had worked in before, but this time it was her bookshop. She filled it with her favourite books and she loved talking to customers about them. She travelled occasionally, something she could never have afforded before, but she always returned to Seabrook, to her beautiful house by the sea, the unexpected inheritance that changed her life. And sometimes, when the wind was blowing just right, she could almost hear her grandmother laughing. Vocabulary notes. Struggling, adjective. Having difficulty and making a lot of effort to do something. Example, she was no longer a struggling bookseller. This means Sarah had a hard time making enough money as a bookseller. Similar words. Struggling can be similar to having difficulty, finding it hard, or coping. Bequeathed, verb, to give something to someone in a will. Example, Mrs. Vance had bequeathed to you her entire estate. This means Mrs. Vance left everything she owned to Sarah in her will. Similar words, left to, given in a will, inherited. Estate, noun, all the property and assets owned by someone, especially at the time of their death. Example, Mrs. Vance had bequeathed to you her entire estate. This includes all her properties, money, and other valuable things. Similar words, property, assets, possessions. Dilapidated, adjective, in a state of disrepair or ruin as a result of age or neglect. Example, a large portion of the money was to be used to renovate a dilapidated old house. This means the house was in a very bad condition. Similar words, run down, derelict, crumbling. Overwhelmed, adjective, feeling a strong emotion, especially when it is too much to deal with. Example, Sarah felt a little overwhelmed. This means Sarah felt a bit lost and unsure because of all the new information and responsibilities. Similar words, overpowered, flooded, stressed. Persevered, verb, to continue trying to do something difficult. Example, but Sarah persevered. This means Sarah didn't give up, even though the renovation was difficult. Similar words, persisted, carried on, didn't give up. Legacy, noun, something handed down from the past, as a person's reputation or a body of work. Example, her grandmother hadn't just left her money, she had left her a legacy. This means her grandmother left her more than just money, she left her a history and a connection to her family. Similar words, inheritance, heritage, tradition. Charming, adjective, pleasing or delightful in a way that attracts. Example, it was a charming place, with colourful houses and a beautiful beach. This means Seabrook was a very nice and attractive place. Similar words, attractive, lovely, pleasant. Story written by Google Gemini 2.0 AI. CC Music, drifting at 432 Hz, unicorn heads. To read all the stories in full, please go to www.steveuk.blog. Thank you.